She lies perfectly still in formalin, suspended in chemical preservation. Her skin has taken on the waxy, translucent quality that comes from a decade submerged in embalming fluid. The left side of her skull shows the terrible damage. 8 blows that fractured bone and ended her life. Her face, once someone's daughter, someone's friend, perhaps someone's wife, is distorted beyond natural recognition. The yellow silk pyjamas with the Chinese dragon are long gone, catalogued as evidence. Now she wears nothing but the indignity of display. The zinc-lined bath that holds her sits in the basement of Sydney University's medical school, and the chemicals that preserve her flesh give off a sharp, clinical smell that visitors never forget. For 10 long years she's been here. Since 1934, thousands have filed past to stare. Artists have sketched her. Photographers have captured her from every angle. A death mask has been made of her face. Police have distributed doctored photographs trying to make her look more lifelike, as if death soaked in formalin for a decade could ever look like life. She has no name, just a designation: the Pyjama Girl, the woman found in the culvert, the body that won't be buried until someone can say who she was. And at the bottom of her zinc bath, beneath the chemical solution that keeps her flesh from decay, something is waiting. 2 pieces of evidence that will, in February 1944, suddenly be discovered after 10 years of examinations by forensic experts. Evidence that will solve Australia's most notorious cold case. 2 pieces of evidence that will appear at precisely the moment Police Commissioner William MacKay needs them most. 2 pieces of evidence that will give this nameless woman an identity. Though 60 years later, researchers will argue they gave her the wrong one. Welcome back to Struth. This is part 2 of the Pyjama Girl. Last time we told you how she died, but today we're going to tell you how the police decided who she was and why modern forensics suggests they got it catastrophically wrong. If you haven't listened to part 1, we suggest you go back now. This is the story of how solving a case became more important than solving it correctly. How a desperate police commissioner, a broken immigrant waiter, and those 2 small pieces of evidence created what may be one of Australia's most disturbing miscarriages of justice. Because sometimes the evidence that cracks a decade-old mystery appears exactly when it's needed. And sometimes that's not a breakthrough. It's a cover-up. By 1944, Big Bill MacKay, who we met in the first episode of this case, had a problem. His department was mired in scandal. The press were constantly criticising the police for incompetence, for their inability to solve a long list of cases. And on top of that list, floating in this bath at Sydney University, was the Pyjama Girl. Picture for a moment Commissioner MacKay at his usual table at Romano's, being served by the man he'd recognised from before the war, Antonio Agostini, the mild-mannered waiter recently released from 4 years of internment, the Italian immigrant whose wife had vanished in August 1934, the same month a woman's body was stuffed into a culvert outside Albury. Linda Agostini was on the list, number whatever out of 125 women who'd never been traced or eliminated. She'd been ruled out years ago because dental records didn't match. But still, the timing was interesting. And here was her husband serving linguine to Sydney's elite, powerless and broken. MacKay had a problem that wouldn't go away. 10 years of failure. A body floating in formalin that the press wouldn't let him forget. And now, purely by chance, one of the 125 possibles was working in the restaurant where he ate dinner. In December 1943, MacKay assigned 2 new detectives to review those files one more time. Fresh eyes, he told them. Work through the names alphabetically, see if the original investigators missed anything important. And when the detectives reached Agostini, Linda, they pulled out the file and saw immediately why she'd been eliminated. The dental evidence was clear. The corpse had 6 fillings. Linda's dentist in Sydney said she'd had 8 fillings, and in different locations. The numbers didn't match. The positions didn't match. 2 separate reasons to rule her out. Case closed, way back in 1934. But then detectives noticed something interesting buried in the file. Linda's dentist had made an admission. He was not in the habit of taking dental charts. He could only attest to work he might have done. No written records, no charts, just the memory of a dentist recalling a patient he'd last seen years before she disappeared. He thought he remembered 8 fillings. He thought he remembered where they were, but he had no documentation to support it. And the dentist who'd examined the corpse in 1934, the file noted he had no previous experience in forensic odontology. He'd counted 6 fillings and plotted their locations, but what if, given his experience, he'd made errors? The detectives reported their findings to MacKay. The dental mismatch that had eliminated Linda Agostini might not be as definitive as it seemed. Perhaps Linda, and therefore Tony, deserved another look. And lo and behold, in February 1944 came the breakthrough. Someone, the records are oddly vague about exactly who, discovered 2 porcelain fillings at the bottom of the formalin bath. After 10 years of the body floating in chemical, after countless examinations by forensic experts, after thousands of people viewing the corpse, after the body had been inspected, measured, photographed and studied more thoroughly than perhaps any other piece of evidence in Australian criminal history. And yet suddenly, there they were, 2 more teeth fillings. The official explanation was simple. They'd fallen out over the years and been overlooked during previous examinations. An understandable mistake, given the condition of the body and the number of people who'd examined it. No documentation existed of who found them or when. No photographs captured the moment of discovery. No forensic report explained why these crucial pieces of evidence had been missed during a decade of intensive examination. They'd simply appeared, right when detectives were reviewing Linda Agostini's file, right when MacKay was under increasing pressure to solve the case. And, as you could probably imagine, those 2 fillings transformed everything. 6 became 8. The number now matched what Linda's dentist thought he remembered. But there was still that pesky location problem. The original 1934 dentist had plotted the 6 fillings in positions that didn't match where Linda's dentist remembered her fillings being. How to explain that? Simple. The 1934 dentist had made errors in plotting the dental work. Given his lack of forensic experience, this was entirely plausible. And with the newly discovered fillings and a reinterpretation of the original plotting, suddenly everything aligned. The dental match that had seemed impossible in 1934 was now a perfect smile a decade later. The body in the bath was Linda Agostini, and now all they needed was a confession from her husband. And conveniently, they knew exactly where to find him. The official report describes what happened on March the 4th, 1944 in Commissioner MacKay's office. Antonio Tony Agostini was called in. Noticing that he seemed to be in a nervous state, the report notes, MacKay asked him what had come over him. Let's just dwell on that for a minute. A mild-mannered waiter, recently released from 4 years of internment, summoned to the office of one of the most powerful and ruthless men in Sydney. Of course he was nervous. Anyone would be nervous. Within moments, and again, reports are vague about exactly how this unfolded, Tony Agostini confessed to killing his wife. According to his statement, Linda had been drinking heavily, making his life absolutely miserable. It all came to a head one Monday morning in August 1934. He woke to find her threatening him with a revolver, and in the struggle that followed, the gun went off and killed her. Unable to face the shame of what had happened, he panicked. He put Linda's body in his car, drove through the night from Melbourne to Albury, a journey of about 300 kilometres. And at the culvert on Howlong Road, he stuffed her body into that potato sack, doused her in kerosene, and set her alight. Then he drove back to Melbourne and never reported her missing. When people asked where Linda was, he simply said that she'd left him. It was a confession that explained everything. After 10 years, the mystery was finally solved. The Pyjama Girl had a name. Except the confession had some rather significant problems. First, there were no records of Tony Agostini owning a vehicle during the Depression. This was 1934, remember. Car ownership wasn't common. If he'd owned a car, there would be registration records, and none existed. But the most damning problem with the confession was what it didn't mention. It didn't explain the 8 savage blows to the skull that actually killed the Pyjama Girl. The gunshot wound, that was real, documented in the medical examination, but it wasn't fatal. What killed her were those 8 brutal strikes with a blunt instrument. Perhaps a tyre lever or a mallet that fractured her skull and lacerated her brain. Antonio's confession, of course, talked about a gun going off accidentally in a struggle. It said nothing about beating his wife to death. And throughout all of this, during the arrest, during the preliminary hearings, during the trial that would follow, Antonio Agostini maintained one consistent position. That's not my wife. Well, maintained it the entire time, except, of course, when he was in that office with Commissioner MacKay. As a result, Antonio was arrested on the 6th of March 1944, just 2 days after his confession, and extradited to Victoria, since that's where he claimed the killing had occurred. The Melbourne Coronial Inquest became what was described as the longest and most complex inquest in the history of Victoria. Expert witnesses made extraordinary claims to explain away the physical discrepancies between the body and Linda Agostini. They argued that brown eyes could turn blue after death. Could they cite a single medical precedent for this? No, but it was theoretically possible. They argued that breasts could shrink after being burned. Could they explain how burning would cause that particular change? Well, no, but again, theoretically possible. They argued that the nose shape, the body proportions, even the height differences could all be explained by the violence of death and the effects of preservation. In the end, the coroner ruled that the body was Linda Agostini, and Antonio was committed to stand trial for murder. The trial began in June 1944 at the Victorian Supreme Court before Justice Charles Lowell. It lasted 8 days. The prosecution presented the confession, the dental evidence, the expert testimony about post-mortem changes. The defence had little to work with. How do you defend a client who has confessed? Antonio's lawyers focused on the circumstances, the struggle over the gun, the panic, the lack of premeditation. And after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the all-male jury returned with their verdict. Not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. Justice Lowe's sentencing remarks expressed something between astonishment and sympathy. In that verdict, I think the jury were merciful to you. My view of the jury's findings is that they thought that you had been for so long sorely tried by your wife's conduct and had been at the time you attacked her, provoked to the limits of your endurance. Antonio received 6 years imprisonment with hard labour. He served 3 and 9 months before being released under a general amnesty in 1948. On August the 21st, 1948, Antonio Agostini was deported back to Italy. He remarried in 1952. He died in 1969 in Cagliari, Sardinia. And until the day he died, whenever anyone asked him about the Pyjama Girl, he gave the same answer he'd given for 14 years. That's not my wife. And so, on the 13th of July 1944, the woman officially identified as Linda Agostini was finally put to rest. After 10 years of floating in formalin, after thousands of people filing past to stare at her, after artist sketches and death masks and doctored photographs, she was placed in an unmarked grave at Preston Cemetery. 4 journalists served as pallbearers. Think about that. This woman who'd been the centre of national attention for a decade was buried with journalists carrying her coffin because there was no one else to do it. No family came forward. Linda's relatives in England were either unaware or chose not to make the journey. Antonio was in prison and wouldn't have been allowed to attend, even if he'd wanted to. So she was buried alone in an unmarked grave, under a name that might not have even been hers. And for 60 long years, that's where the story ended. A solved case, a convicted killer, justice served, until 2004, when a criminologist named Dr. Richard Evans published a book that tore the official solution to pieces. Dr. Richard Evans was a Deakin University criminologist with a PhD in history from Monash. He spent years researching the Pyjama Girl case, and in 2004 he published The Pyjama Girl Mystery, a true story of murder, obsession and lies. His conclusion was explosive and unambiguous. The official solution was police corruption and a miscarriage of justice. Evans documented physical discrepancies that no amount of expert testimony could explain away. The Pyjama Girl had blue-grey eyes. Linda Agostini, brown eyes. Eyes don't change colour after death. That is not how biology works. The Pyjama Girl was small-breasted. Linda Agostini was described by people who knew her as large-breasted. Burning doesn't cause that kind of change in body structure. The nose shape was different. The body proportions were different. The measurements just didn't match. But most damning of all was Evans' analysis of those 2 teeth fillings that mysteriously appeared in 1944. He argued they were fabricated. After 10 years of the body being examined by forensic experts, after countless inspections, suddenly 2 crucial pieces of evidence appear at exactly the moment when police desperately need to solve the case. And they're porcelain fillings that could have come from anywhere, placed in a bath where they'd be discovered at the perfect time. His theory was this: Antonio Agostini did kill his wife Linda, but probably much earlier than 1934. Perhaps he'd stabbed her in her Melbourne home in a domestic dispute, and perhaps he disposed of her body somewhere where it was never found. Linda Agostini did indeed vanish, and Tony Agostini may well have been the culprit. But she wasn't the Pyjama Girl. The Pyjama Girl was probably one of the other 124 women on that list. One of the untraced, the uneliminated possibilities. Her true identity died with her. So, this begs the question why Antonio would confess to a crime that he didn't commit. Evans argues that Commissioner MacKay, mired in scandal and under intense pressure to solve the case, made a deal. A desperate, broken man, just released from internment, with no money and no prospects, was offered a choice. Confess to manslaughter rather than face a murder charge, which still carried the death penalty in 1944. Serve a few years, get deported back to Italy where you wanted to go anyway, or refuse to confess and face investigation not just for this murder, but for what really happened to Linda Agostini. It's a theory, of course, speculation. Evans can't prove it, but it explains so much. It explains why Antonio always said, "That's not my wife," rather than, "I didn't kill her." It explains why the confession didn't mention the 8 blows to the skull. It could even explain why the jury delivered such a lenient verdict. They may have sensed that something was wrong with the evidence. It also explains why Antonio served less than 4 years and was quietly deported. So if the Pyjama Girl wasn't Linda Agostini, who was she? Evans and other researchers have focused on Anna Philomena Morgan, a missing Sydney woman who was on the original list. Remember that in the 1930s, Dr. Palmer Benbow, the controversial forensic investigator who became convinced Anna was the victim, well, he pioneered facial measurement comparison techniques. He took meticulous measurements of the preserved corpse and compared them to photographs of Anna Philomena Morgan. He was certain they matched. In 2022, researcher David Morgan used modern facial recognition software to re-examine Palmer Benbow's work. His conclusion? It's now easy to see why Benbow thought that the corpse was Philomena Morgan. She matches the body. But police in the 1930s had already eliminated Anna Philomena Morgan from their list. Their reasoning? They claimed that Anna hadn't actually disappeared at all. Instead, they said she was Jean Morris, a woman who'd been murdered in Queensland in 1932. This all gets a bit confusing, so let me be clear about what they were claiming. Jean Morris was found stabbed 43 times in Queensland, 2 years before the Pyjama Girl was discovered. Police looked at photographs of Anna Philomena Morgan and Jean Morris and declared them the same person. In other words, Anna Philomena Morgan had changed her name to Jean Morris, and therefore she was already dead. As a result, their conclusion was Anna couldn't be the Pyjama Girl because she was already accounted for as a different murder victim in a different state 2 years earlier. It was an elegant way to eliminate a problematic match from their list. The problem? When you actually compare photographs of Anna Philomena Morgan and Jean Morris, they don't look like the same person. The identification appears to be wrong. Bizarrely, if you look at photographs of Anna Philomena Morgan and the Pyjama Girl, they do look very similar. So with all that in mind, here's what might have happened. Jean Morris is found dead, 1932. Police realise that that's not her real identity. They look around for some missing women and find the name, photograph and missing persons report for Anna Philomena Morgan. Case closed. Then, a couple of years later, inconveniently, a body shows up that looks very much like Anna Philomena Morgan. This leaves police in a bit of a quandary. If they now claim that Pyjama Girl is Anna Philomena Morgan, it means they've completely stuffed up regarding Jean Morris. and they'd have to start that investigation all over again while having egg well and truly on their face. Does this help explain Commissioner MacKay's actions? Is he being pressured from elsewhere to create and support the story about Linda Agostini? Is this part of a massive cover-up, or a clear example of police incompetence stacking up on top of police incompetence? There's also the mystery of the Hessian sack. Remember those markings revealed under infrared light? DALM and ORE, believed to reference the Delmore farming district in Gippsland. The Giannoni family operated Delmore Farm in 1933/1934. They were Italian immigrants, pioneers of biodynamic farming. And Angelo Giannoni was interned during the war, just like Antonio Agostini. Is there a connection? Possibly, but no evidence has ever linked the Giannonis to the murder, and the sack's origin remains unexplained. Their stay in the internment camp, after all, occurred after the murder of the Pyjama Girl. So what we're left with is this. Somewhere in 1930s Australia, a young woman was murdered with extraordinary violence. Someone shot her, beat her to death, burned her body, and dumped her in a culvert on the border between two states. If it wasn't Tony Agostini, her killer was never caught. Her identity was stolen by police desperate to solve their most embarrassing case, maybe to cover up an even earlier mistake. And she lies in an unmarked grave under a name that probably isn't hers, while the man convicted of killing her maintained until death that he'd never seen her before. And if all that's true, the real Linda Agostini is also missing. Doesn't seem to be many winners here. The Pyjama Girl case didn't end with Antonio's conviction. It began a pattern. Dr. Richard Evans documented what happened next in the New South Wales Police Department. His research revealed that following the Pyjama Girl's case, the New South Wales Police pursued a new method of detection. Find your man and make the evidence stick. This approach led to 2 other murder convictions being later overturned when it became clear evidence had been fabricated, or at least manipulated. How many other miscarriages of justice occurred using the same playbook? We'll probably never know. The case also raised profound questions about forensic ethics, preserving a body for 10 years, displaying it to thousands of curious spectators, using it as a public attraction. These practices would be unthinkable today. They were controversial even in the 1930s, with the university registrar complaining about the morbid curiosity that it generated. But perhaps most troubling is what the case reveals about how society viewed women who lived outside conventional expectations. From the moment the Pyjama Girl was discovered wearing silk pyjamas, she was transformed into a moral lesson. The newspapers didn't need to say it explicitly. The message was clear. This is what happens to women who go astray. She was a symbol, a warning, a spectacle. And when police needed a convenient solution, they gave her a name to let them close the file and move on. Linda Agostini deserved better. Whoever the Pyjama Girl really was deserved better. They both deserved justice, truth, and dignity. And they received none of those things. Today, DNA testing could potentially solve this case definitively. The body buried in Preston Cemetery could be exhumed. DNA could be extracted and compared to living relatives of Linda Agostini or Anna Philomena Morgan. We could finally know with scientific certainty who's buried in that grave. But authorities have stated that they have no intention of reopening the case. The investigation's officially closed. As far as the government is concerned, Linda Agostini is buried in Preston Cemetery, and Antonio Agostini was convicted of her manslaughter. So who was she? Maybe we'll never know. For 80 years, she's been waiting for someone to speak her true name. It's truth. Thanks for listening. If this 2-part investigation into murder, spectacle and justice kept you questioning, Follow us wherever you get your podcast. Give us a rating, tell a friend, anyone who likes hearing a good Aussie yarn. Really appreciate all the support that we get. Follow us on the socials. Just look up Struth Podcast, you'll find us out there. And if you've got an Australian mystery case, whether it be true crime or just a spooky, creepy mystery you want me to cover, flick me an email. struthpodcast@gmail.com. I do reply to all of them. It's been wonderful to hear from so many of you from around the world. I really appreciate it. Next time, we'll be exploring a very different kind of Australian mystery, a nightmare on the Nullarbor. Until then, just remember that the line between solved and unsolved isn't always where we think it is. And sometimes, the cases we've closed are the ones that should trouble us most. Thanks for listening.